Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the grocery store produce aisle. Have you ever just marveled at how perfectly uniform and pristine a carton of fresh mushrooms looks? Well, spoiler alert, that is definitely not by accident. We're going to explore exactly how the USDA grades your fungi using their highly specific and, honestly, pretty fascinating official standards. It really makes you wonder, right? Who actually decides what makes a perfect mushroom? Long before that pristine, uniform carton even hits the shelf, it's judged against a seriously strict bureaucratic rulebook. The USDA set up these specific criteria to categorize mushrooms, making sure that when buyers and sellers are trading in the agricultural market, everyone knows exactly what level of quality they're dealing with. So today, we're going to decode that rulebook together.
We're starting right at the very top. Section 1, Grading US Number 1, the gold standard.
Okay, let's dive into this. To earn that highly coveted US Number 1 badge, a batch of mushrooms has to meet a really strict set of physical requirements. First up, they've got to share similar varietal characteristics, meaning, no random mixes of completely different mushroom types in one box. They need to be fresh, mature, at least fairly well-shaped, and well-trimmed. But it gets even more specific than that. They must be completely free from open veils. If you've ever peeked under a mushroom cap and seen those little gills exposed because that thin membrane broke, yeah, that's an open veil. For US Number 1, right out of the gate, those are a hard no. On top of that, they have to be absolutely free from disease, spots, insect injury, decay, you name it. It's basically a demand for pure, unadulterated fungi perfection.
But hey, not every mushroom is perfect. Let's look at the next tier, Section 2, the US No 2 difference, the runner-up.
Now, what's really interesting to see here is just how closely these two grades are actually related. The USDA rulebook explicitly says that the requirements for US Number 2 are pretty much the exact same as US Number 1, just with a few key exceptions. This runner-up grade simply has a bit more leniency built in for natural flaws. It allows a significantly greater tolerance for open veils and general defects. So fundamentally, they're the exact same base mushroom, but US Number 2 gets to play by slightly more forgiving rules.
Beyond just physical condition, we also have to talk about dimensions. That brings us to Section 3, Sizing Up Your Mushrooms, Measuring the Fungi.
And this brilliantly illustrates how sizing works. It's specified purely in terms of the mushroom's diameter, and the USDA does not mess around with rounding. There's a highly specific threshold set right at 1 5/8 inches. If a mushroom's diameter is up to 1 5/8 inches, it's classified as small to medium. Anything over that, it graduates to the large classification. Now, obviously, bulk sorting isn't flawless, so the USDA includes a specific rule for off-size mushrooms. For any given batch, there's a 10% tolerance allowed for mushrooms that happen to miss these exact size requirements.
That word tolerance is incredibly important here. Let's jump into Section 4, Tolerances, Farm to Shelf, and those built-in margins of error.
Produce is fragile, right? And the USDA totally gets this. To account for the normal bumps and bruises from proper grading and handling, they build in specific allowances for failure, which are all measured by weight. Let's break down the rules right at the shipping point, meaning the exact moment those mushrooms are packed up and ready to leave the facility. For US Number 1, only 5% of the mushrooms in any batch are allowed to fail the grade requirements. But for US Number 2, the USDA literally doubles that leniency. They allow a full 10% of the lot to fail the remaining grade requirements at the shipping point. Plus, US Number 2 also allows 10% of the lot to have open veils right out of the gate.
So the crucial point is this dramatic 1% figure. While the general failure tolerances sit at 5 and 10% respectively, the USDA draws a super hard line when it comes to the absolute worst kinds of defects. Across both US Number 1 and US Number 2 grades, the absolute maximum allowance for mushrooms affected by disease, spots, or decay is a tiny, tiny 1% by weight. No matter how much wiggle room they give for shape or open veils, rotten or diseased fungi are strictly capped at this 1% threshold at the shipping point.
But as we all know, mushrooms don't stay fresh forever. They naturally degrade over time. And because of this, the USDA rulebook actually shifts its allowances. The rules literally change on the road. The standards have a completely separate set of tolerances for when mushrooms are checked en route or at destination compared to when they first shipped.
Just look at how drastically the journey impacts that US Number 2 grade. At the shipping point, remember, they're allowed a 10% tolerance for open veils. But mushrooms naturally keep maturing and opening up as they bounce along in boxes on trucks. Recognizing this, the USDA standard dictates that once those US Number 2 mushrooms are en route or arrive at the grocery store, that open veil allowance absolutely skyrockets. It jumps from 10% all the way up to 25%.
That means a whole quarter of your US number 2 mushrooms can have broken veils by the time they reach the market, and they still perfectly meet the official standard.
Let's move on and see how this builds, because even the gold standard gets some travel leniency. Remember how we said earlier that US number 1 demands 0 open veils as a core requirement? Well, once those pristine mushrooms hit the highway, the USDA faces reality. En route or at the destination, that strict 0% rule is completely lifted. Suddenly, US number 1 batches are allowed up to a 10% tolerance for open veils, plus a 5% tolerance for failing other requirements. The journey is just tough on produce, and the rulebook flexes to accommodate it.
And that brings us to the end of our dive into the Agricultural Marketing Services Guidelines. We've seen the absolute strictness of US number 1, the built-in wiggle room for US number 2, those hyper-exact diameter measurements, and how the rules dynamically shift the second these delicate little fungi leave the farm. It really changes how you look at the produce section, doesn't it? So I've got to ask, will you check for open veils on your next grocery trip? Next time you grab a carton, you'll be able to peek under those caps, gauge the diameters, and think exactly like a USDA inspector. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and hey, happy inspecting!